Just to kind of start off, so at the end of the year, Joan actually wrote an article for Telecompetitor called The Top Telecom News of 2024 and the Key Issues for 2025. So given the audience and everything else, I thought that'd be a good starting point. So Joan, the first one I had for you is that, one of the big trends was fiber first. So what does that mean?
So a lot of the providers have made the determination that fiber is the end game. The thing about fiber is that it is the fastest broadband technology out there. It provides the same speed in upstream and downstream, or it's capable of doing that. And once you have it in the ground or once you have it installed, it's pretty future-proof. You can keep doing upgrades pretty easily. There are some companies now that are already offering 25 gigabits per second over fiber, and there are standards in the works for 50 gigabits per second. So the providers are all the landline type providers are looking at eventually, moving to fiber, but it takes time and money. And so you're seeing kind of a little bit of a fiber land grab, because what's also happened is that the providers realize that whoever is first with fiber in a market has a tremendous advantage. And you probably don't want to be fourth or fifth in a market providing fiber, because you may not get a return on your investment. It's expensive to deploy fiber and it takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of strategy happening right now with providers figuring out, how far can I get fiber and how fast.
And so, with that, what's happening? Are we going to see consolidation in the industry? What can we expect there?
Right. So the providers need money to do this, and so private equity firms have seen an opportunity here. They realize that they're seeing an opportunity to put some money into the business, but invest in a company, buy a company outright, and help them build their network out faster. These types of firms eventually want to get out of the business. They want to either sell the company to someone else or do an IPO and make a profit on it. And a lot of these companies are buying more than one company. The kinds of companies they're buying are, in some case, the upstart fiber providers that have been around maybe 10 or 20 years, that are competitive players in a market. And in some cases, they might be a 100-year-old phone company that's in a rural area and has deployed fiber in their own serving area, but they're expanding to areas around them. So that's driving consolidation, because these private equity firms are buying multiple companies up, so then they all become one entity. Another trend that happens is scale. A lot of people tell you telecom is a scale business. In wireless in particular, we saw almost all the regional and small players disappear. Well, if you're in a really rural area, you probably still have a business, but a lot of the regional providers are gone now. You really have the big three, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. And the one holdout was US Cellular. They were a regional player, and they finally realized it's a scale market, and we can't compete, and they're being sold to T-Mobile.
Well, and anytime we hear land grab, one of the things that comes to mind is labor. Costs tend to go up. So what are we kind of seeing?
Actually, I think with fiber, because the technology keeps improving, the deployment costs are going down. I think in that case, really, more so. Yeah, I mean that would be my take on that.
Okay, thank you. So and then we also have kind of some of the cable companies here, Charter and Comcast.
Yeah.
So we had Comcast. But we're kind of seeing different strategies there. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit on the strategy differences?
Sure. So the cable companies, you may know, use a hybrid fiber coax architecture, where it's also called HFC. It uses fiber to a neighborhood, and then there's coaxial cable from that neighborhood point to individual customers. And for years, this gave the cable companies an advantage over the phone companies, because the phone companies had twisted pair wiring. It couldn't carry as much bandwidth as the coaxial cable that the cable companies were using. So for quite a long time, you had the telcos losing market share in markets where they had a cable competitor. But then the phone companies started deploying fiber, which has an advantage over the HFC. It does support faster speeds and also more symmetrical speeds. And there's also been not only are the telecom companies deploying fiber, but you have some of these upstart companies, the ones that have been around 10 or 20 years, just doing fiber. So where the cable companies have a fiber competitor, they've been more challenged. And they are beginning to deploy fiber, but it takes a long time, it takes money to do fiber. And so what the cable companies have done is they've come up with a bunch of different technology initiatives that involve, and the main one is DOCSIS 4.0. That's the latest generation of their cable modem technology. And it is aimed at supporting more bandwidth, and it's particularly in the upstream direction, because the cable infrastructure was originally designed to deliver video. So there's more bandwidth downstream than there is upstream. And internet traffic is still heavier on the downstream, but the upstream traffic is growing at a faster rate because of real-time applications such as video conferencing or gaming. And so that has been a problem for some of the cable companies have only like 10 megabits per second on the upstream. And so this DOCSIS 4.0 helps to address that. Currently, the current generation it can do a gigabit downstream, typically not that much upstream. The DOCSIS 4.0, depending how you architect it, can do multi-gigabit speeds, at least on the downstream, and the upstream is a lot faster than it has been. And the good thing about it is that it's really fast and relatively inexpensive to deploy. It's pretty easy for a cable company to do a whole entire market in a pretty quick time. Companies like Comcast and Charter are talking about with pretty aggressive rollout goals in the next few years, and it's less expensive than fiber to do. We're talking about Charter and Comcast have quoted numbers of like $100 or $200 per home per home passed to deploy DOCSIS 4.0, which is a lot less money than fiber, which can cost in the range of $1,000 per home, or in some cases, thousands of dollars per home. So you shouldn't definitely should not downplay DOCSIS 4.0. It has a lot of potential. Could probably be around there for quite a long time, and does make the cable companies more competitive.
So with that, I mean, fiber is still kind of considered the prime, and the prime technology. Is DOCSIS just kind of extending the life of the HFC network, or is it really competing with fiber directly?
Well, I think for a lot of people it's going to be good enough. It's for a long time you had DSL, which is what the phone companies were doing over copper, and for a while you didn't notice that it was slower than what the cable companies could do. But then as bandwidth demand kept growing, suddenly people wanted what the cable companies had. And I think now the cable companies have jumped a little bit. Maybe it's not as fast as fiber, but they certainly have bought themselves quite a few years. And in some areas, if they don't end up with a fiber competitor, it could be good for a really long time.
And it's kind of interesting. I was looking at the S&P numbers, and I think the share for cable used to be about 65% of the market, and they've kind of gone down to about 55%. A lot of it seems to be gone to fixed wireless, but what do you see as that trend? Is it going to continue, or do you think they stabilize?
So I think that they will not. That's a good question, and it's going to depend on the market. It depends if you have a fiber competitor. It depends on how quickly you're rolling out DOCSIS 4.0 and so on and so forth. But at a minimum, it should cause their rate of decline to slow down and possibly reverse it or stabilize it.
And so we kind of fixed wireless, low orbit satellites, kind of the next thing, right? And that was one of the trends that you kind of called out. But as we kind of dive into this, can you kind of just walk us through the different options for fixed wireless and what that means?
So for a long time, fixed wireless was primarily used in rural areas. And there's really kind of two forms of fixed wireless. The one that's been around for several decades is where a company installs an access point. It could resemble a cell tower, and it can provide service to individual homes and businesses within a certain range of that access point. And it's relatively inexpensive and quick to deploy. And it was an option in areas where there weren't very fast cable or telco offerings. And there's hundreds of small companies all over the country that offer this type of fixed wireless. It's not as fast as fiber or cable. Most of what's out there is 100 megabits per second or less, but the technology keeps improving, and there is technology available now that'll do a gigabit per second using fixed wireless. So it's another thing that will probably be around for quite some time, depending on how costly it is to deploy some of these other options in some of these more rural areas. In the last 3 years, there's a whole different type of fixed wireless that's come up, and it comes from the mobile carriers. T-Mobile is the big player in this market. Verizon also is strong in this area. AT&T less so, but they're getting more into it. This is where the mobile companies use their mobile infrastructure to support fixed wireless, home broadband, but instead of coming over cable or coax, it's coming through the airwaves. And the speeds they get depend on if it's 4G or 5G and various other things, but it's in the range. It can be in the range of hundreds of megabits per second, so it's perhaps not as fast as fiber or cable, but it's less expensive. And for a lot of people, that speed is totally fine, and they just want to save some money. And so those services are doing very well. They're getting a lot of customers.
And so one of the things yesterday we had a presentation from Ian, who does a lot of the wireless piece, and he talked about spectrum limitations and the fact that FCC doesn't have authority to do spectrum auctions right now. So does that put kind of a concern to the fixed wireless from the cell phone providers, and how does that affect the traditional or kind of other style? Yeah,
so the spectrum shortages are less of an issue in rural areas just because there's not as many people using the airwaves. But it's a possible concern for companies like Verizon and T-Mobile that are doing fixed wireless. They make a lot more money. There's more profit margin in mobile service than there is in fixed wireless. And so if an area becomes capacity constrained, the providers would prefer to offer mobile. And a lot of people are concerned that over time, you may not be able to support so much fixed wireless. Until now, none of the mobile providers have deployed infrastructure just to support fixed wireless, although they haven't ruled it out either. But it is something to think about.
Well, and then, we also have satellites, and satellites been big in the news lately. So how does that fit into the picture?
So satellites are another thing that's used primarily in rural areas. For decades or so, there's been the option of geostationary satellites. These are in the sky very high up from Earth. They are so high up that their orbit corresponds with the rotation of the Earth, and so they seem to stay in the same position over the Earth at all times. And they have a pretty big footprint. So it's a way that you can cover a lot of people with one satellite. The downside is that there's delay in the communications because communications have to go from the Earth up to the satellite and back down again. That's a noticeable thing, or it can be if you're doing real-time communications like video conferencing or gaming. And so in more recent years, LEO satellites have become an option. These are low Earth orbit satellites. They're a lot closer to Earth. But you need a lot more of them. You need thousands of these to cover the whole world and even to cover a world region. And the big player in this market is SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company. His service is called Starlink. They have launched a lot of satellites. They still don't have service everywhere they want to, but it's available in a lot of places. They say they do a minimum of 100 megabits per second. And people who use it are happy with it. These are people typically in rural areas where there haven't been other fast broadband options, and so they're happy to get this.
And have you seen anything as far as Kuiper?
Yeah, I meant to mention that too. Yeah, right now it's the only major player in this is SpaceX, but there's other companies planning to come along, including Amazon. And Amazon actually won some funding in the BEAD program in Nevada to do, to deploy service in rural areas. I know they're also approved to bid in some other places, so SpaceX is going to have some competition.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's going to be fun to see kind of, the billionaires battle it out.
Yeah.
But, so, one of the things Larry started with on the conference was talking about convergence. And, now I think it's during the panel yesterday with for the wireless and the broadband players in the room, I think they mentioned that AT&T in their earnings call said convergence like 27 times or something like that.
Yeah.
So, just from your perspective and kind of looking at it, a bigger picture, what does convergence actually mean? And it was something you covered in your article.
Yeah. So providers like to sell multiple services to the same customer. They call it bundling. For years, the big bundle was the triple play of video, voice, and internet. That has really faded because mobile service has gotten better and people are canceling landline voice. And video is beginning to see the same issue because people are using Hulu and Netflix and either cord cutting on video or cord shaving where they cut back on how many services they buy. And so the new bundle is home internet and mobile. And so all the mobile players, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile are all offering bundles of mobile service with home internet, either fixed wireless home internet or fiber where available. And no one can do fiber everywhere, so they can't offer that particular bundle everywhere. And it's driving some of their strategy because we have AT&T making a deal with Windstream to bundle Windstream's home internet with AT&T Wireless, where AT&T doesn't have its own home internet. And it's perhaps driving Verizon's plan to acquire Frontier. Ironically, they're buying back some properties that they sold off 10 years or so ago, or perhaps a bit more longer. And T-Mobile has got some joint ventures to buy some fiber assets. So clearly it's an important trend for these providers. And one more thing, the cable companies are also getting into this because they're making deals to resell wireless service from companies like AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile, and they're bundling that with their home internet, and they're having a lot of success with that. People were skeptical when they launched that, and they're really doing quite well with it.
All right, great. So, I kind of want to dive a little bit more into some specific issues that are facing the industry, but before that, is there any questions, and if anybody want to?
Anything about the technology or bundling or what we talked about so far?
All right. Okay, so let's dive into it. So, I want to kind of talk a little bit about regulation and government. I think, there's going to be a lot happening. So the first one, Jim will talk a little bit more about the specifics of the Louisiana program later today. But, we want to kind of get your perspective on BEAD and what you've been listening to there.
So BEAD, as you may know, is a $42.5 billion program with the goal of making high-speed broadband available to everyone in the U.S. And it's being administered by the states under the direction of NTIA, which is a federal agency under the executive branch. And the states are responsible for it, but they have to, follow NTIA's guidance. And a few states already have awarded funding. The service providers can apply for funding, and they have to contribute at least 25% of the costs in most cases. And the 3 states already have awarded funding to service providers. The good news is that they are all meeting their goals of getting broadband to all the eligible locations in the state. And we've seen a pretty wide range of companies winning the funding. AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Charter, Cox all have won funding. And also some of the LEO satellite operators have won funding. Amazon won some. And in Louisiana, the last I heard, someone had won it, but they hadn't said who. So it could be perhaps Amazon, it could be perhaps SpaceX. And then you have lots of smaller companies winning funding. Some of these 100-year-old rural phone companies are winning funding. Electric co-ops that operate in rural areas are winning funding. So it's a pretty wide range of service providers that are going to be doing these build-outs.
And so what do you think is going to happen with the new administration? I know we have Commissioner Carr now, who seems to be pretty critical of BEAD and a lot of the existing telecommunications policy. What do you expect?
Yeah, so as Augie mentioned earlier, who's ever in the White House, their party controls the things like the NTIA. And so the Republicans have had a couple of concerns about BEAD. Initially, they were making noise that it was taking too long. You're not hearing so much of that lately, in part, I think, because the BEAD program gained a lot of momentum in the last 6 months or so. All of the states have had their initial proposals approved. Some of them, quite a few of them, are taking applications for funding, and we've had 3 states already that have made their awards. And so we don't hear that so much. Republicans always want to save costs, and there is a lot of concern on their part that we shouldn't be spending so much money on fiber because it's too costly. And you have someone like Elon Musk, who's pretty close with President Trump and has LEO satellites. That has a lot of people worried about that. A lot of the traditional providers are worried about that. The rules for BEAD that were established by NTIA say that you should deploy fiber broadband as much as possible. If no provider applies to build out fiber in a particular project area, that the funding can go to someone who's planning to do either fixed wireless using licensed spectrum, or to cable broadband, or to DSL. I don't think you're going to see any money going toward DSL, but it is a possibility. And then for really high-cost areas, and each state sets its own high-cost threshold, the funding can go to fixed wireless using unlicensed spectrum and to LEO satellites. So you may see Republicans wanting to change those rules. There's legally, I think it would be difficult to reduce the budget of the program or to claw back money because it's already been obligated to the states, and it was made available in a bipartisan piece of legislature, and some of the funding has already been obligated to service providers. A lot of the states are already taking applications all under the current rules. So, it's a big question mark to what extent the rules could be changed. There's some other more minor rules that the Republicans would like to change, things like a company can either be required to or perhaps get more points for, be more likely to get funding if they use unionized labor, or if they do climate change assessments and things like that. You might see the Republicans wanting to change some of those rules as well.
Okay, so another kind of big piece on the regulation side, it was an affordable connectivity program. So that's been an issue that was also bipartisan. The money ran out, but can you talk a little bit about what ACP is and kind of the effect on the industry?
Sure. So the ACP Affordable Connectivity Program paid $30 a month toward the cost of broadband for low-income households, and it also offered some discounts on, or it paid some of the cost of equipment. And it went away. It was created during COVID when everyone was staying home and people realized how important it was to have broadband. And since it's been gone, providers have lost some subscribers, people who would have been using this benefit. There were some companies that basically honored, continued to offer similar programs so that they kept more of their customers. They still offered pretty big discounts to low-income homes and things like that. But that was the initial impact. Some people also were concerned that it would make the BEAD program less effective or efficient because providers are determining how much money they want to request based on a business plan that includes how many subscribers they have. And if they don't have as many subscribers, they have to ask for more money, or there was a concern some wouldn't even participate. In the states that have awarded funding so far, that hasn't really been a problem. But another issue that people do raise is that the whole point of all these internet initiatives was to get everyone connected. And several studies have shown that the number one reason people don't subscribe to broadband is cost. Taking this away makes that more of a concern.
So it's kind of staying with that. There was also a Lifeline program. So what's the difference there?
Yeah.
Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. So the Lifeline program has been around for decades, and it's administered by the FCC. It's part of the Universal Service Program, and it paid $10 a month toward either broadband or voice or mobile service, and certainly less than $30 a month. And during the period where you had both that and the ACP, a low-income household could use one for broadband and the other for mobile. Now this is the only option. The good thing about it from the industry's point of view is that it is funded through the Universal Service Program, which gets its money as a percentage of service provider revenues. And so it just keeps getting funding. You don't have to worry about Congress voting every so often to make sure money keeps going into the program. And so it's different in that regard. It's more likely to be around.
Well, so that kind of brings to the next question, right? So Universal Service Fund, that's been in the court. There's some current rulings. Could you kind of fill us in on what's going on with USF?
Sure. So the Universal Service Fund is really 4 programs. It is, the Lifeline is one of them, the low-income program. There's also a program that pays some of the connectivity costs for schools and libraries, and another program that covers some of the costs for rural telehealth. But the biggest part of the program is the high-cost program. This is the program that covers some of the costs of offering voice and broadband in rural areas. And it's about half of the budget. The USF program has a budget of about $8 billion a year, and about half of it goes to the high-cost program. And some people are saying, why do we need the high-cost program if BEAD is going to get broadband to everyone? The rural providers will say, yes, but you have to maintain those networks. And the whole goal of the Universal Service Program is to make sure that the price of service in rural areas is comparable with the price in urban areas. And if you don't have this program, it wouldn't be possible to achieve that goal. So yeah, and the issue with it, which I think you were going to ask me about as well, is about the way that this program is funded. As I mentioned, it's the service providers pay into it as a percentage of revenues. It was originally a voice-focused program, and so it is funded as a percentage of, believe it or not, voice revenues primarily, even though now a large amount of the money goes to broadband. And voice revenues have been in decline, so the percentage of providers' voice revenues that's going to fund this program is now in the range of 30%, and it keeps climbing. And they do pass that on as a charge on customers' bills. So there is a concern that this program can't keep going on the way it is. And there's been a variety of different suggested solutions to this. One of them is that big tech should pay into this. Companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon make their money. They wouldn't exist if they didn't have broadband everywhere. And the argument goes that they should be paying into the fund. The problem I see with that is, where do you draw the line? How big do you have to be to have to pay in the fund? Do you do a sliding scale? I haven't seen any specifics at all about how that might work. And another concern politically is that the CEOs of some of these same companies were at the inauguration with President Trump. I don't think the Republicans are going to look very kindly on the idea of having these people pay into the fund. Another possibility is to have Congress vote on it, like they do with a lot of other things, have the money come out of the general fund. The problem with that, particularly for the high-cost program, is that telecom is a capital-intensive business and takes a long time to get a payback. And the providers are not going to want to have a key source of revenue be at the whim of Congress having to vote every year or two for it. The third possible solution is to include broadband in the contribution base. Instead of paying a percentage of voice revenues to fund the program, they would pay a percentage of voice and broadband revenues. Personally, I think this makes sense because the money's going toward broadband. The argument against it is that people say that it will increase the cost of broadband. The estimates I've heard, however, are in the range of like $2 to $3 a month. And if you're reforming universal service anyway, perhaps you could add $2 or $3 to the Lifeline benefit. But this one also has opposition. So, and all three of these options have strong opposition. And policymakers have really been afraid to touch this. People have known that this was kind of a crazy funding system for years as more and more of the money went toward broadband. It's still coming out of voice revenues. But no one, the policymakers don't want to touch it. And so they keep kicking the can down the road, and we keep funding it through voice revenues. And I'm not sure that's really going to change. It's just because of the political opposition to all the other solutions.
It's interesting because I think, the Heritage Foundation, before the election, published a kind of policy piece, and on the telecom side, it was a lot about bringing in the tech companies into the Universal Service Fund. So you think it's still not a no-go, even with the new administration?
Yeah, I think because you do have Carr wanting that. Mm-hmm. He's in the chair of the FCC now. But you have someone like Ted Cruz wanting it to be funded through the general fund, and Congress votes on it periodically. So, even within the Republican Party, they don't even agree on what the solution should be.
Interesting. Well, so we're going to dive a little bit more into financing and valuation, but just want to take another quick stop to see if there's...
Yes?
New York, the state of New York just had a ruling.
Oh, yeah. The $15 ruling? Yeah.
Just curious to see what your thoughts on that from
Yeah.
policy perspective, and do you think other states would try to go that direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the state of New York imposed a $15, they said providers have to offer a $15 program. And it was challenged in the courts, and the courts said it's okay to do that. It's okay to make that requirement. And the providers have argued, if you have to do this, it's going to hurt investment because people won't be making the providers won't be making as much money. They won't have as much money to invest. And Starlink, SpaceX already asked for an exemption on this. If you have 20,000 customers or less, it doesn't apply to you. And 20,000 customers or less in the state. And AT&T already pulled their fixed wireless offering in that state. So at first I thought maybe you'd see more states doing it, but given the bit of a backlash we're seeing from the providers, I'm not so sure they will. And a lot of that depends on what happens with the Lifeline program, for example, and whether there is a viable low-income offering. So there's a case that came saying that basically is trying to get rid of the Universal Service Fund program. And at first it looked like, this is kind of wacky. But the industry didn't worry too much about it, but it is gaining some traction. I honestly don't know how that's going to come out. And if it does go away, it's a pretty big change for the rural providers in particular, because almost all of them get funding through the high-cost program. And BEAD is coming along, but like I said, it doesn't keep the networks maintained over time. It doesn't keep the cost in rural areas comparable with the cost in urban areas. And if this does go away, it's a real problem, at least for the rural providers in particular. And then did you ask me a second question as well? It was about, the change in the administration, right. I think you're going to see, the other thing is net neutrality. Net neutrality, just so everyone knows, I think probably most of you are familiar with it, but the point of net neutrality is to make sure that providers do not throttle or block legal traffic, broadband traffic we're talking about, and they cannot offer paid prioritization where a content provider or a website would be able to pay extra to have their traffic considered priority and get to people easier than other traffic. And this tends to come and go depending who's in the White House. The Democrats like net neutrality, the Republicans do not. And in general, the service providers don't like it either. They say, we don't do those things. We don't plan to do those things. Even when we have not had the rules in place. We have not done those things. And the Democrats recently, so when the Democrats are in the White House, we tend to have net neutrality. When the Republicans are in the White House, it goes away, and it keeps slipping back and forth. And the Democrats did attempt to impose net neutrality under the Biden administration, and it went to a federal court, and the court basically blocked it, said you can't do it, at least not at this point. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would not hear it. And so basically net neutrality is dead. It would have been dead even if the Democrats had gotten in again. And it's really dead with the Republicans now being in the White House. The only way I see that it could come back is if Congress voted to impose net neutrality rules. One of the issues with it was that several years ago, one of the federal courts said that the FCC didn't have the authority to impose net neutrality unless it was considered a Title II telecommunications service. And those services are regulated more heavily than other types of services. That was another thing that had the service providers concerned. The Democrats said, well, we won't impose all of those regulations, but the industry and the Republicans said, well, you're saying that now, but that could change. So the Title II thing was another big concern. And the only way now really that the rules could come back is if Congress voted to put the rules in place. And I think that's pretty unlikely in the near term. Congress hardly ever, a very small fraction of bills that get introduced ever get passed, and that one has a lot of opposition to it. If someone were to introduce that whole topic has a lot of opposition to it. Yes. Oh, sure. I'm sorry, Jim had it.
One more question.
Yeah.
What's your view on the potential of the 5G fund actually going forward under the Carr administration?
I had not thought about that one, but that's a really good question. There's supposed to be a 5G fund that it would pay some of the costs of deploying 5G in primarily rural areas where it isn't available. And it had a budget, and they had some rules for it. It was delayed because there wasn't good information about what areas would be eligible for funding. And finally, that information was collected from the providers. I think I had not thought about that, but logically, you might expect that to be one of the things that Republicans would oppose or want to cut back on, but I have not heard anything about that yet. I don't think it's really on people's radar at this point. It's pretty much a competitive program. The states all determined their project areas, and providers can bid on a project area, and they can ask for really whatever money they think is appropriate, but they're more likely to get the money if they are the only bidder or the one that, CostQuest came up with we have a lot of you people here today, came up with estimates of what it should cost everywhere to do this, to bring broadband. And they have to be within certain guidelines, but they do a business case. It's really up to the states to determine, who has the best bid or best application for a project area. And they are going to look at, certainly the one that asks for less money is more likely to get it, again, with those certain stipulations that the money should go to fiber where possible. If not, then it goes to these other technologies, and high-cost areas have a whole different option. But it's really up to the states, and so it's not as though there's rules that say you can't make money on this, but some providers may feel that it's just too risky for them.
And I would just add to that, it's one of the things that you wouldn't be subsidizing if it was an economic area to go build out, right? So the goal is really to maximize the amount of funding you could get out. So you try to make it provide incentive, but ultimately every state's going to be different. That's one of the unique things about BEAD. And it's going to be very, very interesting to kind of see if they actually are able to build it out and maintain it for what they're getting subsidized at. And I think that's always a question when you go through an auction.
Yeah, this isn't officially an auction, but it is still a competitive program.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else from?
Yeah.
You gave a good, talk about the convergence of the industries, right, with wireless and telecom and cable, and everybody's coming together. Can you talk a little bit about where you see the U.S. versus maybe Europe and other countries, if you can relay some of that? And second question is, are there any shiny objects or anything that you see in this industry that really intrigues you on the next phase for the next few years?
Sure. As far as our competitiveness with other nations, I mean, there are some people who like to run down the U.S. and say that, we're behind in broadband and so on and so forth. But if, not as many people have it and it costs more and so on compared to with certain countries. Some Asian countries in particular, Singapore, for example, of course they have good broadband. It's a very densely populated area. The U.S. has a lot of rural areas that are very sparsely populated. I mean, I think we have, our rules are less restrictive than they are in quite a few countries, particularly some of the European countries. I mean, I think we have pretty good policies in comparison with other parts of the world in terms of trying to get broadband to everyone. And as far as shiny objects, I mean, this is kind of leading into a whole different area, but there was a talk about quantum computing earlier and quantum networking, and I think quantum networking is a really interesting topic. EPB in Chattanooga, they are the company that first deployed gigabit over 10 years ago, and at the time everybody thought this is wacky, nobody needs a gigabit, and of course now all the providers are trying to offer gigabit service. And they, that brought a lot of prosperity to Chattanooga because all these high-tech companies wanted fast internet and they located there to, it's a lot of startups and so on. And it really had a big impact on improving the Chattanooga economy. They aren't just standing still. What they're doing now is a quantum network. And the idea is it would interconnect these quantum computers, which Augie was saying, we need to interconnect these. And the way it works, it gets rid of ones and zeros. Instead, you use quantum physics to communicate from one point to another. And it sounds really spooky. I mean, it was discovered it goes back to the time of Einstein. They've known about this. And it involves physics. I can't tell you anything other than it involves entangled particles. And so a change to a particle on one end automatically happens to something on the other end. So it's really fast, really secure. But it needs a lot of work. Right now, the communications can't go very far. So they're working on all of these sorts of things in Chattanooga. And I mean, I think that's, in terms of shiny objects, that would be my first nomination for shiny objects.
I appreciate that because we've been all talking about that. Do you cover anybody in that quantum space yet? Or are you aware of any of the major players? Or who do you think is a leader in that space?
I mean, I know a few of the names. The EPB is doing this test bed. There's a company, I can't remember their name off the top of my head, but there's a company that's very closely tied with them that's providing lots of technology for that network. If you ask me, give me your card or something, I can remind you of their name, or just go to Telecompetitor and Google quantum networks, and I've written probably 7 or 8 things about it. I actually won an award for Best Technology Series or something from the American Society of Business Publication Editors, because I think it's a really cool technology. And yeah, there's a few companies. There's a New York test bed as well, and there's a lot of university-led test beds. So there is things happening. There's a company that's doing something in Indiana where they're trying to do something similar. So things are starting to happen there.
Awesome. All right. So okay. So one of the things when Larry put on the agenda that you were going to talk about asset-backed securities, I got really excited because it's me. But especially we're kind of seeing a lot more complexity on financing and deal structure. So let's start with asset-backed securities. Can you walk us through how it's asset-backed, what they are, and how they're being used in the telecom industry?
So asset-backed securitization, or ABS, is where a company borrows money and they secure it with fiber network operations, in specific markets, and the revenues associated with that. And these revenues are viewed as relatively low risk by the lenders. And so they offer better interest rates on those loans. The company that's really been involved in it is Frontier. They were the first kind of publicly held company to do this. But we're hearing that other providers are also looking at it. Larry mentioned the REIT when Windstream spun off its network assets into the REIT, which is Unity. The idea was to save money on taxes, but those two companies now want to recombine. They're planning to recombine, and the reason is that they want to be able to be in a better position to get ABS financing. So it's definitely an interesting topic, and it enables these companies to get fiber further faster because they have, they can just get that much more money for network investment.
So, and part of the other trend has been, and the financing has really been the joint ventures, which we kind of seen from some of the participants in the room. So how does that kind of all tie together?
Sure. So, and that really is kind of part of the fiber trend too. AT&T has a joint venture with BlackRock. It's an investment firm. It's called GigaPower, and the joint venture is building out broadband in areas outside of AT&T's local service footprint, fiber broadband. And I thought it was a smart move on AT&T's part because they're extending their network, more places they can offer the bundle, and they don't have to pay the full cost. They also, that part I think was pretty successful. The other part of it is that they have an open access network there, and the idea behind open access is that other providers would be able to purchase connectivity on that network and use it. Usually, there's a lot of open access networks out there. Usually, the company that operates the network doesn't offer service directly to end users, and AT&T does. And I think because of that, they have signed up very few wholesale customers because the provider that would buy service on that network would be competing with AT&T, and maybe not everyone wants to do that. The other major joint ventures, actually T-Mobile has two of them. Each is with a different investment firm. One of them is planning to buy Lumos, which is an old company that has rural roots that offers fiber in quite a few markets. And the other is Metronet, which is one of those more startup fiber operators that's been around maybe 10 or 20 years or so. And the goal with all these joint ventures is to increase your fiber footprint. Verizon isn't doing any joint ventures, but they are planning to buy Frontier, as I mentioned, and I think that's kind of preoccupying them. I don't know that you'll see them doing joint ventures. The cable companies, I think, are preoccupied with DOCSIS 4.0 and getting that out as fast and as far as they can. And then I think as far as the smaller companies like the rural providers, I think the investment firms would rather buy them outright than do joint ventures with them. So I'm not sure how many more joint ventures we'll see, but it seems to be a smart move for both AT&T and for T-Mobile.
So, and when we see a joint venture, usually it's an off-balance sheet. It kind of goes through it, but can you talk a little bit more about like the incentives for the AT&T from a finance standpoint?
That's more your. I'm gonna leave that one to you.
Well, fair enough. We'll skip that. But we got about 10 minutes or so left, so let's kind of make sure to kick it off and see if there's any questions.
Sure.
We'll leave that for another conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
So this is more from a public policy perspective. So with the BEAD funding and making sure that the underserved and unserved areas get fiber out there, and there's an issue of how much money is available. Most of us are from the tax side of the world, and very few states offer incentives for building out broadband. And it seems to be a little bit of a challenge to get legislation passed in those areas. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that or any views?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few states that had broadband funding programs even before the federal government started making money available to them. And BEAD isn't the first one. There were some others. There was a capital projects fund, made funding available to every state that they could use for broadband or some other things. And a lot of funding was awarded that way. But even before that, you had a few states. Minnesota was one that actually made money available for broadband, and got kind of a head start on that. But a lot of states, in fact, even when you look at their descriptions of the program, they will call it like the Federal Capital Projects Fund program, because they don't want to imply that, oh, we've spent our own money on this. We got it from the feds, and we're spending it. So it's kind of a matter of politics, I think, for whether a state, how how willing a state is to devote its own money toward broadband. And like you say, there are some other things they can do, tax incentives and so on. There was a motion to make it that these BEAD revenue, the funding that you get from BEAD wouldn't be taxable, but I don't think that has gone very far either. So, and again, as long as the states are successful in getting funding, for all of the eligible locations, I think it's going to be a little bit of a hard sell to get them to do more than that, to get the states to do more than what they're already doing. I hope I answered your question.
All right, so if there's no other questions, last thing for me is 3 takeaways. Kind of what do you see as the big thing, 3 things we should take away from?
Sure. So one is, fiber is the end game for at least certainly for the landline-based or the fixed providers. But we also talked about DOCSIS 4.0. We talked about fixed wireless. We talked about LEO satellites. All of those have a position or their place, their niche, and some of those niches are pretty big. None of those are going away anytime soon. So we'll see all those moving forward for quite a few years. There may be some areas where it never makes sense to deploy fiber. I'm really interested to see what happens with BEAD. I know Jim's going to talk more about it. I'm interested to see if the rules do change, if we are able to get broadband to everyone. Some states said they had plenty of money. Some states said it was a little tight. And who wins the money? And do the rules change? And another issue would be, do the providers deliver on what they said they would do? This was an issue in the RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program, a previous rural broadband funding program. A lot of the providers defaulted. And I think policymakers learned a lot from that, and I think the providers learned a lot from that. So I don't think it'll be as much of an issue for BEAD, but it's still something that we would need to keep a close eye on. And I think the whole involvement of investment firms in this area is going to be really interesting, because these firms don't want to be in the telecom business long term. They do eventually want to either do IPOs or sell off these companies. Ironically, you had some companies that were public that went private because they were acquired by investment firms. One example is Brightspeed. Another one is Ziply. And who would buy all these different companies? We're hearing that some of the private equity firms want to get out of this business already. Others, probably have quite a few years before they're looking at that, but who will buy them? If there is an IPO, some of these companies that were public then went private could be public again, or they could be bought by a public held company, and that way they would be public again as well. The only really example we've seen yet of what could happen here is Bell Canada planning to buy Ziply. I don't think that's going to be a typical way that it'll go, because we might let the Canadians buy a company like that, but I think there's a lot of countries where we wouldn't want their service providers to be buying up our assets. So and I think we might begin to see a little more of what could happen here and what the industry could look like in a few years when all this shakes out, and it could be pretty different.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. That was great. And
Thank you.
Question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry. Just out of curiosity, the handset ecosystem in the U.S.,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts around that and the developments of late?
Yeah, because it's been traditionally, for quite a few years, it's been Samsung and Apple, and hardly anybody else had much market share at all. And it has begun to change somewhat. You have, Google has their phone, the Pixel, and it has some interesting features that is causing some people to buy it. That is another business, though, where it's, you really, where scale is important. So it is going to be challenging for other companies to get in it. I know for years, these companies didn't really promote themselves because they thought, oh, that's up to the carriers. And then finally Samsung realized, hey, if you advertise and promote yourself, you actually can, make some pretty big inroads. But I think there's a lot of barriers to entry now for the smaller providers, unless they have an interesting niche, like Pixel does, like Google does with Pixel.